Alex Gardner was mapping Greenland's ice for NASA when his radar hit something that shouldn't exist. A perfect geometric grid of steel and radiation buried 100 FT deep. In this episode, we're going to look at the Project Iceworm cover-up and the 9-day sound that vibrated the entire planet. You won't want to miss this one. In April of 2024, two scientists named Alex Gardner and Chad Green were sitting inside a specialized research plane flying about 30,000 FT above the northwest coast of Greenland. Chad and Alex worked for NASA and specifically the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and their job was to map the ground that sat way down beneath the ice sheet. Now, to do this, they were using a very advanced radar system called U of SAR, and basically how it worked was the plane would fly over the ice and the radar would shoot these waves down and they would punch through the ice. They'd hit the rock at the bottom and bounce back up to the plane. So Alex and Chad, they're staring at their monitors, and for hours it's exactly what you would think. It's jagged lines representing rocks and valleys and dirt. But suddenly, right in the middle of all these jagged natural lines, the radar returns an image of a perfect geometric grid. I mean, these were straight lines, there were angles, and there were distinct rectangular shapes. Alex looks at Chad and he's like, what is this? Because nature does not make perfect grids 100 FT underground, and at first they thought that maybe the radar was glitching or they had found some sort of weird geological formation that just happened to look like a box. But as they circled back and ran the scan a second time, the image got clearer. Now, according to an article published by the NASA Earth Observatory later that year, Alex Gardner realized he wasn't looking at rocks. He was looking at a city. Now you might ask, how does a city end up 100 FT inside a glacier? Well, we have to go back 64 years earlier. On October 3rd, 1960, a group of US Army engineers were standing deep underground inside a tunnel carved out of solid ice. They were huddled around a control panel. They were sweating, and it was freezing in the tunnel, but they were sweating because they were about to do something that had never been done before. They were about to turn on a nuclear reactor inside a glacier. The man in charge was Major Harold Barnett, and he watched as his technicians slowly pulled the control rods out of the reactor core. They were watching the needles on the gauges twitch, and then the reactor went critical. That means it started making power. For a second, they cheered. They had done it. They had brought nuclear power to the Arctic. But minutes later, an alarm started blaring, and they looked at the gauges and they saw that the radiation levels were spiking. It wasn't staying inside the reactor shielding, it was leaking out. Neutrons were literally spilling out of the reactor core and into the snow tunnel where they were all standing. So, as you imagine, they scrambled, they slammed the control rods back in, they shut the reactor down, and they grabbed lead bricks, heavy gray bricks, and they ran to the reactor housing and they started physically stacking them up against the leak, trying to plug the hole before they all got radiation poisoning. They managed to stop it. But as they stood there in the dark, breathing hard, listening to the hum of the cooling pumps, they had a realization. They were now trapped in a bubble of heat surrounded by miles of freezing ice with a nuclear machine that was already starting to fail. Now, if you had asked anyone back in the United States what was happening in Greenland, they would have told you it was triumph. They would have told you it was a science city because officially, this base, which was called Camp Century, was a research station. That's what the army told the public, that's what the government of Denmark, because Greenland was a Danish territory. They said that they were there to test construction techniques. They were there to drill ice cores to study the climate. And to be fair, they did do those things. But the way they built this place was insane. I mean, starting in 1959 under the command of Colonel John Kirkering, the army had driven these massive convoys of tractors across ice. And they used giant Swiss snowblowers called Peter plows to cut deep trenches into the ice. Now, they didn't dig tunnels, they cut trenches that were open to the sky, and then they lowered these corrugated steel arches into the trenches to make a roof. They covered the roof back up with snow, and once the snow hardened, they had these long empty tunnels underground, and inside they built a town, they built barracks, they built a kitchen, they built a chapel, they even built a barber shop. One of the guys who lived down there was a young engineer named Austin Kovac. And according to interviews Kovac gave years later, living in Camp Century was disorienting, to put it lightly. I mean, you'd wake up in your bunk and it was warm, you could go to the mess hall and get hot food, you could go to the theater and watch a movie, but then you would walk out into Main Street, which was the big central tunnel, and you would remember where you were. The walls were made of snow, the floor was ice, and there was this constant low rumble of diesel generators and the nuclear reactor, of course. And unfortunately, in the beginning, it smelled like raw sewage because they were just dumping their waste into a hole in the ice. You could imagine how lovely that's got to be. However, despite the smell and the danger, the soldiers were told that this was important work. They were proving that humans could live anywhere. They were conquering the Arctic. And for years, Camp Century was the pride of the army. A glacier isn't a rock, it flows, it moves, and as it moves, it crushes things. Now, by 1962, the men started to notice that the tunnels were shrinking. The walls were slowly closing in on them. The ceiling was getting lower. Austin Kovac described how they had to form ice trimming squads. Now, these guys would go out into the tunnels with chainsaws and giant picks, and they would just spend all day cutting the walls back just to keep the base from crushing them to death. It was a losing battle. Now, according to a 1961 report by the Army Corps of Engineers, the ceiling of the reactor room began to sag. It dropped 5T in just a couple of years. And they realized that if it kept dropping, it was going to crush the nuclear reactor. And if that happened, they wouldn't just have a leak, they would have a meltdown. Now, in 1963, the Army realized they had lost. They could not stay. The ice was simply too strong. So they decided to evacuate Camp Century. Now, they did remove the nuclear reactor core, put it on a sled, and shipped it back to the US. They didn't want to leave a live nuke in the ice, but they didn't take everything. They left the buildings, they left the steel arches. And according to a study published in the Geophysical Research Letters in 2016, they left behind a massive amount of waste. They left behind 200,000 L of diesel fuel in addition to 240,000 L of sewage. They also left behind toxic chemicals called PCBs, and they left behind the cooling water from the nuclear reactor, which, by the way, was radioactive, and they poured it into a sump, which is a hole in the ice, and they let it freeze. Now, the biggest reason they did this was because they believed that the ice here was pretty much eternal. I mean, they figured, hey, this is Greenland, it snows more than it melts. This space is going to get buried deeper and deeper every year, and it will be encased in ice forever, so it's safe, right? No. In 1967, the last soldier walked out of Camp Century. He turned off the lights, he climbed up the ladder to the surface, and he shut the hatch. And for decades, it just became forgotten about. It was buried in the snow. Now, keep in mind that at the time, the Danish government assumed it was just an abandoned service station. I mean, the American public didn't even know it existed. But in 1995, the Danish government decided to do some digging. Literally because there had been a scandal in Denmark about nuclear weapons, and the Danish parliament ordered an investigation into what exactly the US military had been doing in Greenland during the Cold War. So investigators began combing through declassified American documents. Eventually, they found a report from 1960 that was titled Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Cap. And when they opened it, they found something that shocked them. They found a word, iceworm. And it turned out Camp Century was not a science station. It was a lie. It was a cover story. And even more interesting is that Camp Century was actually a prototype. It was a pilot program for something called Project Iceworm, and Project Iceworm was insane. The Army's plan was to build a massive network of tunnels under the Greenland ice sheet. I mean, not just 21 tunnels at Camp Century, but we're talking 4,000 kilometers of tunnels. And inside, they were going to build an actual railway system, and riding on these rails would be 600 nuclear missiles. The idea was that they could shuttle these missiles around under the ice constantly. That way, the Soviet Union would never know where the missiles were, so they couldn't target them. And if World War II ever started, the US could pop these missiles out of the ice like a jack-in-the-box and simply fire them at Russia. That was why they needed the nuclear reactor. As you could imagine, the Danish government was pretty pissed. They had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on their soil, and the US had been planning to turn their territory into the largest nuclear launch pad in the world completely behind their backs. But of course the project had failed. The ice moved too fast, the tunnels deformed, and the missiles would have been crushed. And so the Army had scrapped Project Iceworm, abandoned it, and then pretended that it never happened. When this news came out in 1997, it was a huge diplomatic incident. Eventually it settled down. People figured, it's over. The base, the missiles, it's all gone. The reactor core, it's gone. But then 2016, a climate scientist named William Colgan, along with a team of researchers, began to really study the data coming out of Greenland, and what they found really bothered them. They found that the Greenland ice sheet is melting, and it's melting fast. Now, remember how the Army assumed that the snow would keep piling up and bury the base forever? Well, Khan's study proved that assumption was wrong. The study showed that within the next 75 years, the ice covering Camp Century is going to melt away. And when that happens, everything that was left behind, including the 200,000 L of diesel, the PCBs, the sewage, and the radioactive cooling water, is going to be released. And it's not just going to sit there because as ice melts, it turns into water, obviously. And where does that water flow? Downhill towards the ocean. So you could just imagine how lovely that's going to be for the rest of the world when that gets there. Now, unfortunately, nobody knows what to do about it. It's incredibly dangerous and expensive to try and dig it up now. But if we wait, it's just going to be a disaster waiting to happen. So when NASA flew that plane over Greenland in April of 2024 with Alex, and they saw those grid lines on the radar screen, they weren't just looking at a cool historical artifact. This was a ticking time bomb. The city under the ice is still down there. And unfortunately, when it does see the light of day again, it's going to bring with it a lot of radioactivity. On the morning of September 16th, 2023, a seismologist named Dr. Stephen Hicks sat down at his desk in a windowless office in London, England. Dr. Hicks worked for University College London, and his job basically was to listen to the planet. He spent days staring at computer monitors that showed live data streams from seismometers, which are sensitive instruments buried in all the ground over the world that detect vibrations. Now, usually Dr. Hicks was looking for earthquakes, and he knew exactly what an earthquake looked like on a screen. It was messy, and you would see it because there'd be this violent spike, the crack of the earth breaking, and it would turn into this chaotic squiggle that would slowly fade out over a few minutes. Visually, it was unmistakable, but this morning Dr. Hicks looked at his monitor and he saw something that made him pause because there was a line on the screen, but it wasn't a spike. It was a very perfect rhythmic wave. It went up, it went down, it went up, it went down, and it was slow. In fact, the vibration was pulsing exactly every 92 seconds. So he sat back in his chair, he rubbed his eyes, and he looked at it again, and he thought, the sensor's got to be broken, or there's a construction crew working near the sensor, and it had to have been a heavy truck driving by every 90 seconds. I mean, this had to have been a glitch. And so he pulled up the data from another sensor in a different country just to confirm that it was a local glitch. He pulled up a sensor in Kenya. Unfortunately, he saw the same line, the same rhythm on the same frequency, and so now he's thinking like there's something going on here, that this is not normal. Wanting to verify his newfound fears, he pulled up a sensor in Antarctica. It was there too. He pulled up the sensors in North America and Asia, folks. It was in every sensor he could find. The entire planet was technically vibrating from the North Pole to the South Pole. And so he gets on social media and he posts a screenshot of this impossible signal, and he's asking his colleagues like, is anyone else seeing this? What is this? Immediately replies start coming in from seismologists all over the world. Nobody knows what it is. According to the logs from that day, the scientists start calling it a USO, an unidentified seismic object, and the theories fly in. Some assumed it was a secret military test, maybe a submarine weapon that was firing low-frequency waves, but others thought that it might be a kind of new volcanic eruption. But the signal was too clean to be volcanic because volcanoes are messy. This was very mechanical looking in the waveform. It was very precise, and I hadn't mentioned this yet, but the strangest thing is that it wasn't stopping. I mean, you think a volcano, an earthquake, they all last for a short amount of time, whereas this went on for 1, 2 hours, 24 hours, and it was still going, and in fact it didn't stop. And so 9 days later, folks, the signal had finally faded. But for 9 days straight, the planet had just been vibrating. Dr. Hicks and the entire global scientific community were just scratching their heads because they didn't know what this was. A very different drama had been playing out in a remote corner of the Arctic just 48 hours before the signal ever started. And this part of the story comes from maritime records and news reports that at the time seemed like a separate incident. On September 11th, 2023, 5 days before the signal, a luxury cruise ship called the MV Ocean Explorer was sailing through a place called Alport in northeast Greenland. It was huge. It had over 200 people on board. That included tourist, crew, and guides. And these were folks who had paid a lot of money to see the untouched wilderness of the Arctic. Unfortunately, the ship got stuck in the mud at the bottom of the fjord. The captain tried to free it. He revved the engine. He tried to rock the boat, but it simply wouldn't budge. And so for 3 days, these 200 people were basically stranded in one of the most remote places on Earth. They were miles from help, and the nearest other ship was days away. And you could probably imagine how tense things were on board. People panicking, people worried about running out of food. They were worried about the hull breaching. There were reports that some of the passengers had gotten violently sick, and so they were isolating in their cabins. I mean, this was a very bad situation. But on September 14th, 2 days before the signal started, a fishing research trawler arrived. They attached a heavy line to the cruise ship, and at high tide, they managed to pull the Ocean Explorer free. The passengers cheered, the crew was relieved, and the ship sailed away, heading south out of danger. And everyone on board just thought we almost had a disaster. But folks, they had no idea. According to the report published later in the journal Science, if that ship had been stuck for just 48 more hours, it would have been right in the path of something that would have killed every person on board. Now, back in London, Dr. Hicks and a team of 68 scientists from 15 countries were deep in this mystery. They even tried to call Scooby-Doo and the gang, and they weren't available. They could not figure out the mystery of this USO. They did know that it was not tectonic, it wasn't plates rubbing together, it wasn't volcanic, and so they didn't really know where else to look because what other massive sources of energy are there? Well, eventually they got a report from the Danish Joint Arctic Command. The Danish military patrols the waters around Greenland, and interestingly, they had received a report of some damage at a place called the Lear Research Station. Now, is this tiny island deep inside the fjord system, and on this island there is a cluster of small wooden cabins. Some are used by scientists, some for the military, and some are very old. I mean, trappers and hunters have been using this site for 200 years, but on September 16th, it was empty. It had been closed up for the winter. And when the Danish military patrol boat, the Knud Rasmussen, finally made its way into the fjord to check on the station, the soldiers on board were shocked by what they saw. The station wasn't damaged, the wooden cabins had been smashed into kindling, equipment worth 200,000 had been washed away, and the ground had been scoured clean. As the soldiers looked around, they noticed something. On the cliffs surrounding the fjord, there was a distinct line where vegetation had been stripped away. I mean, it looked like someone had taken a giant pressure washer on the side of the mountain, and they measured the height of that line. It was 200 meters high. That is a splash marker taller than the Washington Monument. And so they took photos. They sent this data back to the scientist and Dr. Hicks and his team. They overlaid the location of this destruction with the origin point of the seismic signal. And wouldn't you know it, it matched perfectly. So now they knew where it came from. It came from Dixon Fjord in East Greenland, but they still didn't know what it was because a landslide, I mean, even a massive one, creates a boom, not a 9-day hum. So a Dr. Christian, who's a geologist from the Geological Survey of Denmark in Greenland, started looking at satellite photos of the area before and after. And he saw that a massive chunk of mountain peak about 4,000 ft above the water was somehow missing. A glacier at the base of the mountain had been melting for years, and on September 16th, the permafrost holding that mountain together finally gave up. 25 million cubic meters of rock and ice broke free, which is roughly the same volume as 10,000 Olympic swimming pools just plummeted vertically, reaching speeds of almost 100 meters, slamming into the narrow fjord below. Okay, well that's cool and all, but how do we get the 9-day hum from that? After analyzing the data more, they ran some simulations, and after they finally understood why. Now, the rock hit the water at 11:35 a.m. local time. It created a tsunami over 100 millimeters high. But Dixon Fjord is weird. It's narrow, it has very steep walls, and crucially, it has a sharp 90-degree bend in it. So when that massive wave traveled across the fjord, it hit the other side, but it couldn't flow out to sea because of the bend there. So it bounced back, and then it hit the other wall, and it bounced back again. And the computer simulation showed that the time it took for the water to slosh from one wall to the other was exactly 90 seconds. It matched the seismic signal perfectly. The water would slam into the north wall, the energy would transfer into the crust, ringing the planet, and 45 seconds later, it would slam into the south wall. And because the fjord was so deep and the walls were so steep, the water didn't lose energy, it just kept rocking folks for 9 days. Now, going back to the Ocean Explorer, the scientists realized that if that ship had been stuck when the mountain fell, it wouldn't have just been hit by a wave. It would have been inside a washing machine for 9 days. I mean, their ship would have been thrown against the canyon walls every 90 seconds. It would have been ground to pieces. Nobody would have survived. And the craziest part is because it's so remote, nobody would have known it happened until it was all over. And just to prove this wasn't a fluke, almost exactly 1 month later, on October 11th, 2023, the sensors in London picked up the signal again. Same frequency, same location, but this time it was quieter. Another piece of the mountain had fallen, but because the first one had already happened, they knew exactly what it was. What's truly frightening, though, is that in the future, we have no idea how many more times this is going to happen and mysteriously the effects it could have.